On a bright and shiny day at the manor, inside one of the rooms, the atmosphere was tense. Javier stood with a serious look on his face and spoke with firm emotion as he told Soho that he would duel Sir Newman in 1 month's time and asked if he was confident about winning. Soho replied back with carelessness while lying casually on the bed. He asked if Javier was dumb, saying of course he was not confident. He explained with frustration that Sir Newman was a trained knight, a low-level sword expert who could even use the powerful man-heart skill, while he, Soho, was just a regular person with no skills. He questioned what Javier was thinking and if he was even using his brain. Javier stood in front of him, slowly moving his hand away from the hilt of his sword that was tucked at his side. He had been so close to drawing his sword and cutting Soho down, but he stopped himself. As he looked at Soho, his mind was filled with confusion. He thought deeply about Soho's recent actions. Soho had thrown dirt in Sir Newman's face out of nowhere and challenged him to a duel. At first, Javier believed Soho had returned to his old ways, behaving like a reckless troublemaker. But something about it all seemed too well planned to be just random foolishness. Javier remembered that Soho had also asked the Baron to keep them apart, which created the perfect situation for him to provoke a fight with Sir Newman. Then Soho chose Sir Byron to act as a substitute overseer to supervise the soldiers' work, another move that seemed strangely strategic. And now, despite setting all this up, Soho claimed he was not confident about the duel. None of it made sense to Javier. He felt disgusted by the whole situation. He wished he could just pull out his sword and end Soho's nonsense right there. Soho slowly stood up, rubbing off his hands, and looked at Javier with a serious expression. He spoke while rubbing his hands and asked for a favor. He wanted Javier to do something important. Then, with a bright and convincing smile, Soho said he wanted to learn how to use a sword. He wanted Javier to teach him. But Javier, standing firmly and showing no emotion on his face, refused with a serious tone. He said no without even thinking twice. Soho reacted with worry and shouted, asking why Javier would not help him. Javier explained coldly that his only duty was to watch over Soho, not to train him. Then, with sharp words filled with anger, he added that if someone like Soho, someone he called scum and even corrected himself to say human trash, ever learned to use a sword, it would only bring more danger to the people around him. Javier's words were harsh and full of judgment, showing how little he thought of Soho. Soho, instead of getting angry, just pointed out how Javier did not even soften his words when correcting himself, and then asked again if that meant he truly did not want to teach him, even if teaching him might help cure his insomnia. That made Javier pause, his eyes turning sharp with confusion. He wondered how Soho knew about his insomnia, something he had never shared with anyone. Meanwhile, Soho smirked with confidence. In his mind, he thought about the book he had read, a book that told him everything. He already knew the cause of Javier's sleepless nights. It was written clearly in the story called The Knight of Blood and Iron. He knew that knights were ranked in 4 stages, that was Sword Master, High-Level Sword Expert, Mid-Level Sword Expert, and Low-Level Sword Expert. He also knew that Javier was right at the edge, about to move from a high-level sword expert to a sword master, something few could achieve. Soho understood that Javier's sharpened senses, which made him a near superhuman, were the reason he could not sleep. It was the side effect of being at the border between human and superhuman. Soho looked straight at Javier and asked boldly if they had a deal or not. He told him there was no use in pretending anymore, saying it was obvious from his tired face that he had insomnia. Javier let out a deep sigh and, with a look of quiet agreement, finally gave in. He said they could try. Soho's eyes lit up with excitement, and he asked again if he was serious, reminding him there were no take-backs. Javier nodded with a firm smile and confirmed it. But he added that he was sure Soho would fail. He explained that he had already tried everything to cure his insomnia, from sleep therapy and special herbs to aromatherapy, exercise, and even traditional Eastern medicine. Nothing had worked. He believed nothing could help him now. But before he could finish talking, the scene changed. Javier was now sitting on a chair, fast asleep, his head tilted slightly as he dozed off. Soho stood in front of him with a loud, triumphant laugh, full of amusement. He told Javier he had figured everything out, and also knew exactly how to cure his insomnia. In his mind, Soho remembered the moment it happened. He recalled how Javier had first fallen into a deep sleep while listening to a magic spell. So Soho got creative. Instead of using magic, he took out something even more powerful, his reinforced concrete textbook. He had read it out loud to Javier, again and again, at least 18 times, and it worked even better than any spell. Soho smiled with a wicked grin, proud of his clever trick. He believed he had completely outsmarted Javier. Now that he had helped him sleep, Soho thought that Javier owed him. In Soho's mind, he had won. He had not only found a way to cure Javier's insomnia, but also gained the chance to learn swordsmanship from one of the strongest knights. In his eyes, everything was going exactly according to plan. On another shiny day, the sky was clear, and the sunlight covered the ground like gold. Javier stood on the training field with his usual serious face and gave a strict order to Soho. He told him to run 50 laps around the perimeter. Without arguing, Soho started running immediately. Javier watched him with a surprised look, thinking how strange it was that Soho was actually following the order without complaining. He was confused. This was not like the Soho he knew. The sound of Soho's footsteps echoed across the training ground as he kept running. After a while, Soho shouted in frustration. His face was red, covered in sweat, and he was clearly tired, but he did not stop. He yelled that he did not like this and begged Javier to teach him some sword skills instead. Still, he kept running. As he came around again, he pointed at Javier with a playful smile and shouted proudly that Javier never expected him to do it. He said Javier had thought he would give up right away and refused to run. Then Soho came around once more with a big smirk and laughed loudly. He said that Javier probably planned to tell him he did not have what it takes, just to avoid teaching him. But now, Soho shouted with joy, he was going to finish running all the laps and prove him wrong. At that moment, a funny message appeared on the screen like a game. It said the passive skill Annoying Brat had increased to level 4. It also joked that Soho's behavior was so irritating that his head was practically begging for someone to slap it. Even though Soho was being loud and playful, he was showing real effort. Soho shouted with frustration, his fists clenched tightly as he ran, yelling that he knew Javier had just made that annoying message up and told him to buzz off. Even though he was angry, he kept pushing himself to keep running. He took deep breaths, feeling the burn in his legs and chest, and thought to himself how hard this really was. He admitted in his mind that it was not easy at all. Then his thoughts drifted back to his past life in Korea, and everything suddenly felt heavier but clearer. He remembered waking up every day alone in a small, cold room inside a boarding house. He had no family to welcome him, no comfort waiting for him. His life was filled with non-stop work. During the day, he carried heavy bricks up to the roof of a 4-story building, and at night, he worked even harder, loading and unloading delivery trucks just to earn enough money to survive. He had lived each day afraid of starving, holding tightly to a small hope that maybe someday, life would get better. He had told himself over and over to hang on just a little longer. He reminded himself that he was working hard and that he deserved a better life. He believed things would change if he just endured a little more. As Soho ran, sweat dripping and breath heavy, he smiled to himself. Compared to the pain and hopelessness he felt back then, this training was nothing. The suffering of that past life gave him strength now. That despair had shaped him, and he refused to give up now when he finally had a chance to fight for something more. He kept running, more determined than ever, repeating in his heart that he could do this. Javier watched from a distance, his sharp eyes focused on Soho's struggling but steady form. As he saw the determination written across Soho's face, he realized something had changed. Soho wasn't just playing around. He was truly trying. He was serious. That effort touched something inside Javier, and with quiet resolve, he made a decision. If Soho was this determined, then he would teach him, not just any moves, but his own sword-fighting techniques. As Soho continued to push himself during training, a notification suddenly appeared in front of him. It said his approval rating from Javier had increased by 1 point. Even though it was still very low at -28, it showed that he had made a little progress. He also earned 18 RP for improving his relationship with an important character, bringing his total RP to 29. It was a small but important step forward, showing that his hard work was beginning to pay off. Later that night, the scene shifted. The full moon shone brightly over the manor, covering everything in a soft silver glow. Inside a quiet room, Arcos sat calmly in his chair. His elbows rested on the wooden table, and his chin leaned on one hand. Standing before him was Sir Newman, tall and silent. Arcos looked deeply troubled. He spoke with sadness and disbelief about Soho's recent behavior. He could not believe the level of disrespect Soho had shown, especially after everything Sir Newman had done. Newman had protected the family for 5 generations with loyalty and strength. Arcos had truly believed that Soho was changing, that he had finally come to his senses. But now, it seemed like he was wrong. Though hurt by the situation, Arcos admitted that he had no real reason to stop the upcoming duel. It had already been set in motion. Still, his tone changed to something sharper as he gave a direct order to Newman. With eyes filled with firm authority, he told him not to go too far. As the heir to the family, Soho must not be seriously harmed. Arcos wanted Newman to be strict, to make Soho realize his mistake, but without causing him lasting injury. Newman gave a respectful bow to Lord Arcos and answered with calm obedience, saying he would follow his order. But once he left the room and walked alone along the quiet path, his true feelings came out. Anger twisted inside him as he clenched his teeth. In his mind, he thought bitterly that duels did not always go the way people expected. He imagined a darker outcome. If, during the fight, he ended up cutting off Soho's head and killing him, and if the Baron tried to punish him for it, then he would go even further. With a chilling smirk, Newman thought that he could kill the Baron and the Baroness too, and make it look like they took their own lives. In his twisted plan, after getting rid of everyone, he would leave the small village behind and move to a bigger, more powerful place. As he walked, his thoughts became more dangerous. He even laughed to himself, thinking that Soho's reckless challenge had only helped move his evil plan forward more quickly. Then the scene shifted again. The sun was shining brightly over the manor, and the day of the duel had finally arrived exactly 1 month later. The fighting hall was filled with energy as people gathered to watch. A ring had been set up, and a crowd stood all around it, whispering with excitement and worry. Among there was Lloyd's mother and father, their eyes focused on the 2 men about to fight. In the center of the ring stood Sir Newman, calm and dangerous, holding his sword with sharp focus. Across from him stood Soho, who did not look nervous at all. Newman asked in a steady voice if Soho was ready, calling him young master. Soho gave a confident nod. Instead of a sword, he had a shovel, which he stood upright in the soil before kicking it up and resting it on his shoulder. With a wide grin, he shouted that he was more than ready. He said he was going to knock Newman's lights out, smiling as if he did not feel fear at all. In the fighting ground, Soho stood tall with a firm smile, holding a solid iron shovel over his shoulder. The crowd around him murmured in surprise and confusion. People could not believe their eyes. Someone whispered in shock, asking if he was really going to fight Sir Newman with a shovel. It seemed like a joke to everyone watching. In front of Soho, Newman clenched his teeth, clearly annoyed and angry at being challenged in such a strange way. From the upper floor, Javier observed the scene carefully. He remembered that Soho had requested something from the blacksmith, and now he understood what it was: a solid iron shovel. Next to him, Lord Arcos sat in his chair, rubbing his forehead in frustration. He could not believe it, and said with disappointment that it seemed like Soho had turned everything into a joke after all. But Javier did not agree. His eyes were serious as he thought about everything Soho had done in the past month. He remembered how Soho trained every single day, waking up early in the dark morning hours to do basic exercises without complaining, running across the construction sites to teach the villagers about Andal heating systems, and practicing sword moves until the moment he went to bed. None of that looked like the actions of someone preparing for a joke. In Javier's heart, he felt strongly that Soho, now called Master Lloyd, was more serious than ever before. Finally, Lord Arcos raised his hand to signal the start of the duel. His voice echoed loudly across the fighting ground as he shouted for the duel to begin between Lloyd Frontera and Sir Newman. The tension in the air grew stronger. All eyes were locked on the 2 fighters in the ring. As the duel began, Newman gripped his sword tightly, ready to fight with full strength. Soho, standing across from him, took a strange and awkward fighting stance while wearing a wicked smile. From the upper floor, Javier watched with doubt and confusion. He questioned what kind of weak pose Soho was trying to use. It did not look like anything a real swordsman would do. Newman, already annoyed, charged forward and swung his sword at Soho with anger. But Soho quickly lifted his shovel and blocked the attack, causing the sword to bounce back with a loud clang. Everyone watching, including Javier and Arcos, stared in confusion. They had not expected that. Newman's eyes narrowed as he tried again, thinking that Soho just got lucky the first time. But once more, Soho blocked the sword using his shovel with perfect timing. Javier's eyes widened in surprise. He realized there was nothing random about Soho's movements. They were smooth, powerful, and very efficient, not flashy, but perfect for real fighting. Javier thought that Soho's fighting style looked like a modern version of swordsmanship, as if it had evolved and been reshaped through time. Even Newman began to feel confused. He had not expected someone like Soho to fight this way. But Soho simply smiled and raised his shovel, asking mockingly why Newman looked so shocked. Inside his mind, Soho thought proudly that any Korean man would recognize these moves. He had been trained in bayonet fighting, a modern form of hand-to-hand combat used by soldiers. He saw the shovel not just as a tool, but as a powerful weapon. As Soho zoomed forward with his shovel, Newman quickly dodged to the side with a scream, trying to avoid getting hit. Soho grinned again, thinking to himself that the shovel was far more dangerous than most people realized. It was not just a silly trick anymore, it was a real fight, and Soho was fighting with skill, confidence, and a plan. Soho continued to block Newman's attacks with his shovel, using it more and more like a shield. As he blocked another swing, he thought to himself that the wide blade of the shovel could protect him just like a shield. Then, he jabbed the shovel into the ground, and to everyone's surprise he jumped on it like a pogo stick, bouncing up and down. He laughed and taunted Newman, telling him to bring it on and come at him. The crowd watched in shock, and Javier couldn't tell if Soho was serious or just making a joke. His actions were so strange, but he still moved with surprising skill. Newman, frustrated and angry, rushed towards Soho with a scream, ready to end the fight. But Soho, with confidence, took his fighting position and reflected on his preparation. He thought about the two weapons he had planned to use in the duel. The first was the shovel, and the second was the basic sword fighting techniques he had learned from Javier. As Newman attacked, Soho expertly blocked every swing, making Newman question where Soho was getting all this strength from. Newman's frustration grew as he tried again and again to strike him down. In that moment, Soho smirked and thought that his third weapon was finally ready. A message appeared on the screen: Skill Expansion, Shoveling Level 1. Soho realized that when he held his shovel, he became one with it, and all of his physical abilities increased. His strength was now even greater. He also thought about his approval ratings, the +1 he had earned from training with Javier, and the +2 and +3 from the Baron and Baroness, who had seen their son working hard for the first time. All of these things had increased his RP, making him stronger in this duel. Soho remembered when a message appeared on the screen, showing that his current RP was 97. The message offered him the chance to learn the skill shoveling for 40 RP, and Soho quickly chose to accept, excited about the new skill he was about to gain. With this new power, he felt even more confident in the fight. Meanwhile, Newman, frustrated and feeling the pressure, took a deep breath. He realized that he had no choice but to use his special skill, Manheart, which was a powerful ability that only skilled knights could summon. Newman's heart began to glow as he summoned the Manheart within his body, preparing for a more dangerous attack. Soho noticed this and understood what was happening. He thought to himself that Newman was about to unleash Manheart. Newman raised his sword and, with clenched teeth, shouted that the fight was only beginning. Soho looked at him with a serious expression, unsure of what to expect next. As Newman rushed toward him with increased power, Javier, watching from above, knew how difficult it was for an average person to summon Manheart. For someone without special skills, it usually took over 10 years, and even for a regular knight, it could take at least 5 years. Javier thought that it would be impossible for Soho to block such a powerful attack, especially with all the mana Newman was using. Newman attacked with full force, determined to defeat Soho. In his mind, he thought that he would easily break Soho's shovel and crush his head in one powerful blow. But to everyone's shock, Soho, with calm focus, blocked the attack by slamming his shovel directly against Newman's sword. Lloyd's parents, watching from the sidelines, were stunned, their eyes widening in disbelief. Despite the powerful attack from Newman, Soho had managed to defend himself. Newman was completely caught off guard and overwhelmed by a strange, draining sensation. As he felt his strength leaving his body, his eyes widened in shock, and he thought to himself in fear that it felt like all the strength in his body was vanishing. Meanwhile, Soho, with a sinister smile on his face, prepared to unleash the fourth weapon in his arsenal, the technique he had been planning for this moment. He thought to himself that now, for the fourth weapon he had prepared, the mana conjuring skill that made Javier the strongest man in the world in this story, the Azrahan core technique, would be his. This technique allowed Soho to drain Newman's mana, weakening him even more. Newman, still struggling to comprehend what was happening, gasped and asked if Soho had absorbed his mana as he bent backward, feeling the effects of the technique. But Soho was not finished yet. With a swift and powerful swing, Soho slammed his shovel into Newman's face, knocking out his teeth and sending them flying through the air. Newman, utterly confused by the pain, thought that what had happened was his tooth flying through the air. But before he could fully process the situation, Soho raised his shovel again and slammed it down onto Newman's head with full force, causing Newman's body to crash hard onto the ground. The crowd around the arena gasped in disbelief. Even Lloyd's parents could not hide their shock as they watched the event unfold. As whispers spread throughout the crowd, many people started murmuring in disbelief. One person whispered that Master Lloyd had won. Another questioned what was happening, while another voice spoke, asking what was going on. Amidst the stunned silence, Arcos raised his hand high in the air, trembling with shock, and declared that Lloyd Frontera was the winner of the duel. The crowd was still processing the announcement when Newman, still lying on the ground, thought in shock that he had lost to a lowlife. The realization hit Newman hard as he struggled to accept his defeat. The powerful and experienced fighter had been outmatched by Soho, who had used his cunning and strength to defeat him completely. As Newman lay on the ground, still trying to process what had happened, Soho spoke out loudly. He placed his shovel on his shoulder and said with confidence that he had won the duel. Well, now that is over with, it was time for Newman to take a pounding. Soho then raised his shovel up, preparing to attack again. Newman's eyes widened in shock as he struggled to understand what Soho was doing. Suddenly, Arcos shouted with urgency, calling out to Lloyd, asking what he was doing and reminding him that the duel was over. But Soho did not listen. With an amused tone, he began to attack Newman again, shouting, "Take that." Soho's voice was filled with excitement as he prepared to strike Newman once more. Arcos, desperate to stop him, shouted Lloyd's name in warning. Soho had raised his shovel high, ready to strike Newman, with his face showing both determination and anger. Just before he could swing it down, two soldiers had rushed forward, grabbing him tightly and shouting urgently for him to stop. One of them had yelled that it was enough, Master Lloyd, while the other had cried out that the duel was over. Arcos, who had been standing nearby, had turned to Javier with a confused look on his face and asked if Soho had lost his senses. Javier, still watching the scene unfold, had not been able to offer an answer and had thought to himself that he did not know if Soho had lost his senses. As the soldiers had held Soho back, he had raised his hands in surrender, signaling that he would stop. He had shouted that it was fine and had asked them to let go. The soldiers had released their grip on him, and Soho had relaxed for a moment, placing his shovel on the ground and taking a deep breath. But just as the tension seemed to ease, Soho had suddenly slammed the shovel into Newman's body, which was already falling to the ground. The soldiers had quickly grabbed him again, yelling for him to stop, but Soho's calm face had shown no signs of hesitation. Javier, watching closely, could not help but think that Soho was attacking with such precision, as if he intended to hurt every part of Newman's body. His face had remained calm, almost as if he had predicted everything that was happening, as though he had known exactly how the fight would unfold. Javier's mind had wandered back to something Soho had said to him 15 days earlier, just before the duel. Soho had asked him to teach him the Azrahan core technique. Those words had stayed with Javier, making him wonder what Soho had been planning all along. Javier had turned his head when Soho had asked him why he looked like he was on the run. Soho's voice had been sharp as he continued, asking if Javier had been trying to teach him how to steal something. Soho had seemed sure about a technique, saying that it drew mana from the surroundings, not just from the individual using it, and that Javier must have been talking about it. Javier had felt confused, not understanding how Soho had known about the technique, especially since it was something he had never shared with anyone. He had quickly asked Soho how he knew about it. Inside, Javier had been panicking a little, thinking that it was a technique he had not told anyone about and that it was not even finished yet. Soho, however, had seemed unconcerned. With a shameless smile on his face, he had casually explained that Javier had talked about the technique in his sleep every time Soho had sung him a lullaby. Javier had stared at him, wondering if he had imagined things, especially because Soho's face had looked unusually bold. Still, there was no way Soho could know about the technique unless Javier had spoken about it in his sleep, which seemed impossible. Javier had then apologized but firmly said that he couldn't teach Soho the technique yet, since it wasn't finished. As Javier had spoken, Soho had finished his sentence for him, asking if that meant Javier would teach it to him once it was perfected. Javier had nodded slowly and said that if it was possible, yes. Inside, he had wondered what gave Soho so much confidence. Soho had made it sound like there was no doubt that Javier would eventually teach him the technique, and Javier had felt a bit surprised by his boldness. Soho stood confidently, sticking his sword into the soil as he began explaining his thoughts to Javier. He said that he was guessing Javier was trying to take the outside mana and combine it with the man heart inside him. He pointed to show the difference between his hands, one representing the man heart, and the other representing the outside mana. He continued, trying to make sense of the situation. He said that as a result, it went boing and bounced off. He thought that seemed obvious. From Javier's mana heart's point of view, it was a foreign object, right? Soho paused for a moment, and then shared his idea. He said that it was a matter of changing the way Javier was looking at it. He told him not to think of it as mixing the absorbed mana into the man heart, but instead, to think of it as condensing it separately nearby and using it around him, on the outside. He compared it to having an auxiliary engine next to the main engine. They were connected, but also separate. He asked what Javier thought, and said that it sounded good, right? Javier listened carefully, and while he thought it sounded reasonable, he was not completely sure what an engine was. He tried to ask Soho how he knew, but Soho quickly interrupted, grinning. He said that he was just spitballing. He asked if it made sense, and clapped his hands as if he had just made a great point. Javier could not hide his confusion and frustration. Inside, he thought that it was that face again. He clearly knew something. Despite Soho's bold attitude, Javier was left with a sense of uncertainty. Soho seemed so confident about the idea, yet Javier still was not fully convinced by the explanation. With a calm expression, Javier thought to himself that, in that moment, he had finally perfected the Azrahan core technique, something he had been struggling with for a long time. On his first try, he had been able to successfully create 3 circles. With more training, he believed he could reach 4, 5, or even more. Just then, a message had appeared on the screen, showing that his approval rating by Javier had increased by +5. Soho, noticing the change, had asked if Javier had thought he had nothing better to do than learn how to use Manheart. Soho had quickly added that he did not need all of that, and just wanted to learn the absorbing part. He had only needed the mana that came into contact with his body, not the mana from the air. Javier had thought to himself that Master Lloyd, or Soho, had determined that with this new knowledge, he would be able to defeat Sir Newman. Javier had continued to think that, indeed, Soho had won easily. Suddenly, Arcos had shouted at Soho, demanding that he stop and claiming that he would not tolerate him sullying the knight's honor any longer. Soho, wiping sweat from his brow, had taken a deep breath and asked, with a calm but somewhat tired tone, if that knight's honor, his lord? He had then pointed toward Arcos and told him to look under the tablecloth and decide if those words were befitting of Sir Newman. The tension in the air had grown as Soho seemed to be ready to challenge Arcos's accusations. Arcos had been confused when he removed the cloth from the table and saw the letters, murmuring with confusion, "Letters?" He had then opened one of the letters and said, with his eyes widening, that it was something unexpected. Soho had informed him that they were letters between Sir Newman and Tords, the man who had defrauded him in a real estate deal. He had explained that the letters contained everything they had discussed about the financial status of their land, their lordship's preferences, and their plans to forge real estate documents. Soho had told him that all of it was in those letters. Newman had thought with shock and panic that he had hidden the letters in a wall. He wondered how Soho had found them. Meanwhile, Soho had grinned to himself, thinking that Javier would later find them in the book. He had sent Padong to search for them the night before. Soho had then thought about Arcos, realizing that he was really a kind person, just as described in the book. He had noticed that anyone else would have demanded Newman's head right then, but Arcos had not. Soho had felt that while Arcos was kind, being a kind leader and a good leader were two completely different things. Turning to Arcos, Soho had offered a suggestion. He had said that if Arcos was thinking about how to deal with Newman, he had a suggestion to make. Arcos had asked, with curiosity, what the suggestion was. Soho had suggested a strange idea to Arcos. He had said that they should drop a vicious mouse on Sir Newman's head. If Newman was hurt by the mouse, he would be exiled from the land. However, if he was not hurt, Soho had proposed demoting him to a foot soldier and giving him the chance to repent. Soho had then asked what Arcos thought of this idea. The crowd had murmured, confused by the suggestion. One person had wondered why a mouse of all things. Another had said that Sir Newman would never be hurt by a mouse. Someone else had questioned whether this was truly a good idea. Arcos had thought with confusion that what Soho was proposing was to give Newman a test that would offer him a chance to repent, while also making him aware that he could be given a greater punishment at any time. Byron, standing nearby, had said with a serious expression that it was a wise decision. He had thought that it was generous, while also serving as a warning to others. Arcos, after thinking it over, had agreed with Soho's idea. He had said that they should do as Soho had suggested. Soho had then turned to Newman and asked if he had any objections. Newman, trembling, had replied with gratitude that he had no objections and was thankful for Soho's mercy. Soho had thought to himself, "Mercy, you say?" Soho had thought that offering a guilty party a merciful outcome would not lead to a change of heart or repentance. He had believed that it was impossible for someone guilty to change. He remembered the words of others saying, "What is wrong with him? He is soft." Soho had thought that the guilty would only grow more stubborn and cunning, thinking of ways to rise above others. Newman, with an evil smile, had whispered to himself that they would regret this decision. He had sworn that he would take revenge on Baron Frontera and his low-life son. Soho, hearing this, had replied that it was nice to see Newman smile, though it would be the last time he would ever do so. Newman had looked at him with confusion and asked, with a trembling voice, what Soho had meant by that. Soho, with a calm expression, had asked him what he thought it meant as he gave a red sunflower seed to a hamster. The hamster had flung the seed into the air, and Soho had explained that the best way to ask for forgiveness was to remember that there was none. As the hamster ate the seed, it had suddenly grown to an enormous size. Everyone's eyes had widened in shock as they saw the hamster floating in the air. When the hamster had begun to land, Soho had quickly run to one side. Newman's eyes had widened in shock as the hamster slammed onto the ground, right on top of him. The ground had cracked under the impact. Soho had smiled and pointed, saying that it was a shame, and declared Newman's exile. Soho had thought to himself with amusement that, with this, the rotten apple of the land was gone. The sun was shining brightly, and the sky looked clear as the small hamster dug through the soil with surprising speed and energy. Javier watched in confusion, his eyes fixed on the tiny creature, and he asked Soho with curiosity, "What is Sir Podong doing?" Soho replied with a smile and said, "He's carving out a road." His eyes then drifted to the soldiers nearby, who were drenched in sweat, their muscles tense as they worked hard under the sun. Soho continued with a calm tone while watching them that now that the once feeble soldiers look like proper construction workers, the real work can begin. He spoke as if inspired by something great, and said there was once an ancient city called Rome, and they were absolutely enamored with roads. The method they used to build the Great Appian Way, I will use that starting now. He turned his head and pointed into the distance as he explained it will go from his lordship's manor to the base of the eastern mountain. Javier blinked in surprise and asked with doubt why a road. Soho gave a firm smile, lifted the shovel onto his shoulder, and walked with confidence as he replied, "Just you wait and see. It's going to put our land on the map." For a while, Javier stood there, watching Soho's determined steps, his mind puzzled by everything he had just heard. His thoughts raced as he remembered all the strange and impressive things Soho had done recently. Then he asked with disbelief, "Master Lloyd, where did you suddenly acquire this knowledge from? You built a heating system that no one had ever heard of and summoned a high-level creature out of nowhere. Are you really Master Lloyd?" His voice trembled with suspicion. A sudden message flashed across the screen like a sharp warning in bold red letters. It read, "Warning, Javier has suspicions about your identity." Soho's heart jumped in his chest, and he thought with worry from what I saw in the book about his character. If he finds out that I am someone else who has stolen the body of his lord's son, he may very well use his sword on me. He would do that, and more. Soho's mind raced, the weight of the danger pressing down on him like a heavy storm cloud. But then his expression shifted with sudden confidence, and he reminded himself with a smirk, "There is no reason to be worried, because I have a special skill for times like these." He turned to Javier with dramatic worry in his voice and asked, "I studied while no one was looking. Why? Am I not allowed?" Another message popped up on the screen, glowing with power and purpose. It said, "Special skill, stubborn insistence activated." Javier frowned with doubt and replied, "While no one was looking? All you do is drink." But Soho quickly stepped forward and pointed a finger straight at Javier, his tone sharp and challenging as he asked, "And you were watching me 24 hours a day? No, right? Before I went to sleep? While I was taking a dump?" Do you know what I was doing? You do not, do you? His words were fast and loud, and Javier was taken aback for a moment. But Javier was not ready to drop his suspicion. He narrowed his eyes and asked with serious doubt, then how do you explain the summoning magic? That is something even a skilled mage with 20 years of training would have a hard time. The tension grew thick in the air like a rope being pulled tight. Soho stood his ground and fired the question right back at Javier, his voice sharp with frustration as he asked, how are you so good at conjuring mana for someone in their early 20s? You never had a teacher, did you? Did you? We must have a genius here. His tone was loud and full of sarcasm, trying to flip the pressure away from himself. Javier answered calmly and honestly, his expression serious as he said, no, I never thought of myself as a genius. Soho did not let up and pressed on with an annoyed voice, so you can be a genius, but I cannot? I was born with a gift of summoning, so what? His voice echoed with stubborn pride, and for a moment Javier just stared at him, speechless and confused, unsure of what to say. Then Soho suddenly turned away with a cold tone and said, if you have nothing else to say, I am leaving. I have things to do. The moment grew awkward and tense, but then a new message flashed on the screen like a closing curtain. It said the end game of special skill, stubborn insistence. Speedy topic change. Soho began walking away and thought with relief, did it stick? I think it did. It is okay, he smiled to himself as the stress slowly faded from his face. He stopped in front of Byron, who stood tall with his hand resting firmly on the hilt of his sword. Soho spoke with confidence and gave the order, Sir Byron, please see to this road while I am gone. Byron nodded with respect and answered, yes, sir. I will take care of this. Have a good trip. As Soho turned to leave, Javier stepped forward from behind and said with duty in his voice, let me come with you. It is my job to watch you. Soho chuckled with a smirk and replied, of course you are coming with me. What a silly thing to say. Javier raised an eyebrow and asked with growing interest, where are you going? Soho smiled calmly and informed Javier, somewhere far. I need to take back some money that was stolen from us. His voice was light, but there was a clear purpose behind it. The journey ahead was not just about traveling, it was about justice. Far away from them, in a small border town called Ladenia, the atmosphere was completely different. Inside a dimly lit room, a man sat on a chair with frustration burning in his eyes. He suddenly slammed his fist on the table and shouted with anger, damn it. His teeth were clenched tightly and he pressed a hand to his forehead, clearly worried and panicking as he muttered, unbelievable. To lose that much money. They must have used some sort of trick. That man was known as the real estate conman towards, and he was sweating from fear more than from heat. Standing behind him was another man with a sharp, serious expression. He watched towards without pity and said coldly, isn't that how gambling works, though? Until now, you have also earned your fortune that way. On that note, if you cannot pay for me to protect you, I will be taking my leave then. His words were heavy and threatening. Towards quickly turned his head and shouted with a trembling voice full of desperation, I have enough for that. I will come up with the rest, so you cannot go. He was clearly afraid of being left alone in such a dangerous situation. But the man did not smile or soften his tone. He warned calmly, do keep in mind that I will be gone the moment you default. The conman clenched his teeth and spoke with bitter confidence, I can always find another easy mark to get money from. First things first, there are people out to get me, so let's stay hidden for a while and... But before he could finish, the wooden door burst open with a loud crash. Soho kicked the door wide open and stepped into the room with a powerful presence. His voice rang out sharply as he asked, were you talking about me? The conman jumped up from his chair, startled and afraid, and shouted with alarm, who are you? Soho walked in with a smile on his face and said, that's right. You do not know what I look like. Then he leaned forward and added with a smirk, I'm Lloyd Frontera. Does that ring any bells? The conman's eyes widened and his mouth dropped open in shock. Before he could speak again, the man beside him asked with a cold tone, shall I kill him? But the conman panicked and shouted, no. Run. Let's run. Without a second thought, the man grabbed the conman by the arm, smashed through the window, and leapt into the air. The broken glass scattered around them as they flew out and landed hard on the road below. But the moment they touched the ground, a shadow stood in their way. Javier was already waiting, his sword raised and eyes sharp. He stepped forward and said in a steady voice, leave him here and walk away quietly. If you refuse, I will see you as a co-conspirator. Inside his mind, Javier thought with satisfaction, it is just as Master Lloyd said. They will try and escape out the back window. Wait for them there. The man stared at Javier with disbelief and asked with confusion, "You are so young. Do you even know how to hold a sword?" But the calm, powerful look in Javier's eyes gave him the answer without words. Soho stood by the broken window, watching the scene unfold below with focused eyes. He thought to himself while remembering the novel Javier vows revenge after he loses his master, Baron Frontera. He manages to find the conman, towards, and fights his bodyguard. It is Javier's first time coming face to face with a dark enchanter. He struggles to hold his own against gravitational magic. Then Soho grinned and added, "In the novel, I mean." On the road outside, the bodyguard of the conman stretched out his hand, releasing a wave of dark energy. It glowed with a heavy force and shot toward Javier. But Javier met it with his sword, the blade clanging with a sharp sound as the energy scattered around him. The man sneered and said coldly, "So naive, die." Then he clenched his fist, and suddenly the ground beneath them began to rumble, as if the road itself was shaking under the power of his magic. Soho continued to think in the book, when Javier fights that guy, he was just your average high-level sword expert. But now Javier is equipped with a triple circle manheart. He watched with excitement as Javier summoned that powerful manheart, and a bright light surrounded him. The dark enchanter stared at him with confusion, clearly not expecting such power from someone so young. Javier's sword glowed as he swung it with force, the air slicing loudly around him. For a brief moment, his body felt heavier, his steps harder to move. He frowned and asked with surprise, what was that just now? Was that magic that increases one's weight? The battle was heating up, and Javier was now standing toe-to-toe with a powerful enemy he once was not strong enough to face. The dark enchanter floated in the air with a confused look on his face. Without showing any emotion, he turned to the conman and told him in a cold voice that their contract was no longer valid. He did not wait for any reply and quickly flew away, leaving the conman standing alone and terrified. The conman, panicked, reached out and shouted angrily, calling him a jerk, but it was already too late. The bodyguard had disappeared. Just then, Javier stepped forward with a serious and angry face. He looked down at the frightened man and asked him if he understood how serious it was to commit fraud against a noble family. The conman, now full of fear, started to back away quickly. But in his panic, he tripped and fell hard to the ground, screaming in pain as he hit the dirt. Javier, burning with righteous fury, raised his sword into the air and shouted that he would cut off the man's legs and make him crawl to the courthouse for his crimes. His sword was already swinging down, ready to punish the criminal. But suddenly, Soho rushed in and stood between Javier and the conman. His face was tight with tension, and his teeth were clenched. He shouted loudly for Javier to stop, saying he was going too far. Soho's voice was filled with urgency and anger as he warned that if the conman was taken to court, they would surely give him the death penalty. Javier froze in place, shocked by Soho's strong reaction. His eyes widened as he stared at Soho in disbelief. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. Soho was actually showing mercy to someone who had done him wrong. Javier had never expected Soho to be the kind of person who would choose pity over revenge. The wooden chair creaked under the weight of the conman, who was tied up tightly with thick rope. His hands were bound behind his back, and his body trembled with fear. Sweat ran down his face as he sat helplessly, eyes wide, staring at the young man sitting calmly across from him. Soho sat on another wooden chair, leaning slightly forward with a firm smile on his face. He placed his elbows on the rough table between them, resting his chin gently on his hands as he looked straight at the conman. Soho spoke with calm confidence and a light tone of reason, said there was no need to be so scared, that everyone feels greedy sometimes, and he understood why the conman used his chance when he got it. Soho's voice was steady, and his eyes did not blink, as he said that beheading someone for greed seemed like a punishment too cruel for the crime. The conman replied with hope in a trembling voice and asked if Soho was really going to forgive him. His eyes were desperate, searching Soho's face for a sign of mercy. Soho nodded with a soft chuckle and confirmed that he would not take the conman to court, that he was being kind, and the man should feel thankful. Then Soho leaned in and said with a cold smile that, in return, the conman would hand over all of the remaining assets of the Baron. The conman grinned widely, almost with relief, and answered with fake joy that of course he would do it, and if that meant being forgiven, then he would gladly give it all away. But the moment of peace did not last long. Soho's tone became serious again as he told the conman that giving up the assets was not enough, that it was just the beginning. He said they were far from done. The smile on the conman's face faded quickly and his expression changed into one of worry and fear. Soho looked at him with eyes that held no mercy and explained that if the conman truly wanted forgiveness, he would need to do something more. The conman was terrified but desperate to live, so he replied with complete submission and said he was ready to do anything Soho wanted, that Soho's word was now his command. The air in the room grew heavy with tension as Soho held all the power, and the conman realized his fate was no longer in his own hands. The wooden table between them now held a fresh sheet of paper and a pen, as Soho calmly slid it toward the conman with a firm smile on his face. The room stayed quiet except for the sound of the pen scratching across the surface as it stopped in front of the conman's shaking hands. Soho leaned back slightly and explained with steady confidence that it was simple, that all the conman had to do was sign the contract and everything would be settled. The conman looked down at the paper with confusion and then looked up, asking nervously what kind of contract it was. Soho replied with a light, almost casual tone that it was just a normal employment contract, nothing strange, and it would even include a paid salary. But then his tone shifted as he added a sharp condition: 80% of the salary would be held back to repay the huge amount of money the conman had stolen from them. Soho smiled as he informed the conman that after only 520 years of work, the debt would finally be paid off. The conman's mouth fell open in shock, his face pale with disbelief. Behind Soho, Javier stood with arms crossed and a knowing look in his eyes. He had expected this all along and silently thought to himself that he knew Soho was never really going to forgive the man. At that moment, Soho's inner thoughts twisted with dark amusement as he smirked to himself, thinking there was no way he would be stupid enough to kill someone who still owed him a debt. That debt was valuable, and he had no intention of letting it disappear. He planned to keep the man close and drain every bit of use out of him for the rest of his life. The conman, still tied to the chair, shouted with fear and frustration, calling the contract a shamefully unfair agreement. His voice cracked as panic took over. But Soho stayed calm and asked coldly if that was really how the man felt. Then his expression darkened as he added that he wasn't going to force anyone to sign, and if the conman didn't want the deal, they could always just go to court. The weight of that threat crushed the last bit of hope in the conman's heart. His body trembled again, and tears began to spill from his eyes, running down his cheeks as he realized he had no other choice. With shaking hands and a heart full of regret, he slowly reached forward and signed the paper, sealing his fate. The sun was shining brightly and the sky was clear as a single horse pulled a wooden carriage down the road. The wheels turned gently over the path, and inside the carriage Soho sat facing Javier. The wind rustled through the trees as the calm morning passed peacefully. Javier leaned forward and spoke with a relaxed tone, telling Soho that since they had gotten some money from the conman, they did not need to worry about paying interest for a few months. But Soho looked surprised and asked what Javier meant, then explained with excitement that he had no plans to save the money. Instead, he was going to invest it in hiring more men. Soho thought the current project needed more hands, and 30 soldiers were not enough. However, he sighed in frustration and wondered aloud if anyone from the village would even apply, considering how bad his reputation was. He knew people still saw him as a troublemaker, and that image was making things harder than it should be. A few days later, under the same bright sun, a new scene unfolded at the Frontera barony. A large billboard stood tall in a public space with bold letters announcing that workers were wanted. It promised a weekly salary of 20 gold, and anyone interested was told to inquire at the tourney square near the Baron's estate. The news spread fast, and soon a long line of villagers formed in front of Soho's desk. The people looked eager, some dressed in work clothes, others still wearing simple peasant robes, all hoping to be hired. Soho sat at the table with a sharp gaze, looking at the line of people. He narrowed his eyes and asked quietly if these were not the same people who used to hate him. Standing just behind Soho, Javier replied with calm understanding that yes, they absolutely did hate him before. But things had changed. Soho had kept his promises. He delivered affordable Andal heating systems exactly on time, took care of a traitor who had betrayed the village, and even summoned a spirit when needed. His actions had earned him trust. Javier added that now people did not see Soho as a hooligan anymore, but as a reliable and skilled man, someone worth following. As Soho sat at the chair, watching the long line of villagers eager to sign work contracts, his eyes widened in disbelief. He could not understand it. In his mind, he thought with surprise how all of this respect and kindness could come just from a few things he had done. He did not expect this kind of reaction at all. Suddenly, a man stepped forward and politely interrupted his thoughts, asking if he could sign the work contract. Snapping back to attention, Soho quickly told the man to go ahead and sign, trying to act normal. The man smiled warmly and began to speak from the heart. He told Soho that he was very grateful and explained that in past winters, his child had always suffered badly during the cold spells. But thanks to Soho's Andal heating system, this year was different. Their home was warm, and they didn't have to worry anymore. With deep respect, the man gave a low bow and thanked Soho sincerely. For a moment, Soho was caught off guard. His eyes widened again, this time with confusion and surprise. Then he gave a soft, honest smile and told the man he was very happy to hear that. But inside, Soho felt a bit awkward. He had only started the Andal system to make money and satisfy his own greed. Now, hearing how much it had helped people, he felt embarrassed, not knowing how to react to their honest gratitude. The man then added that he had a relative who lived in the nearby Lacona land, and that person was also interested in ordering the Andal system. He asked if Soho would be willing to accept that order too. Soho's eyes opened wide again, but this time it was not confusion, it was excitement. In his mind, he thought that this was exactly what he had been waiting for. This was the first real step in his bigger plan. He had not been building Andals at a loss for nothing. Every free or cheap system he had built before was leading to this moment. Now, with a clever grin, he thought about how he could even raise the price a bit by adding travel expenses. He felt ready to clean up and earn big from here on out. Everything was finally starting to move just the way he had hoped. With a confident smile and a businesslike tone, Soho told the man that of course he would accept the order from Lacona land, but the relative would have to pay extra to cover travel expenses. As soon as Soho said that, Javier, who was watching from nearby, narrowed his eyes and thought to himself that there it was again, that sly look on Soho's face. He now realized that Soho had planned all of this from the beginning. That was the real reason Soho had built those Andal systems at a loss, not out of kindness, but to trap people into wanting more. But then Javier's thoughts turned to something else that had been bothering him. If that was Soho's plan, then why was he spending time and effort building a road that led straight into the mountains? In the next scene, the two of them stood side by side at the edge of a thick forest, looking out at the towering mountains ahead. The sky was wide and clear, and the air smelled like pine. Soho suddenly called Javier's name, and Javier quickly responded, asking what he needed. Soho looked at the trees with excitement, and told him that soon, all of these mountains would be stripped bare. Javier blinked in confusion and asked what he meant by that. Soho turned to him and began to explain with energy in his voice. He said that the Andal system they were using required a massive amount of fuel, far more than what the nearby trees could provide. Javier's eyes widened as the truth started to hit him, and he began to ask why Soho went forward with everything even though he knew this would happen. But before he could finish, Soho jumped in and revealed the next part of his plan. He told Javier that this was exactly why he was building the new road, the Appian Way. He pointed to the end of the trail and said proudly that they were going to start mining black coal there. Then, with a loud laugh, Soho announced that they would sell the coal at a high price to anyone using Andals. Once people got used to the comfort of Andal heating, they would never want to go back to living without it. Soho added with a smug grin that he would give a small discount to the people in their own land, but only a tiny one. Javier's sharp eyes focused on Soho, and in his mind, he could not help but think how sneaky and clever Soho was acting. But right then, Soho noticed his expression and turned his head slowly toward Javier. His smile was gone, and his face had turned serious. With sharp eyes and a steady voice, Soho asked if Javier thought he was sneaky and devious. He did not wait for an answer and continued by asking a hard question. If he did not do things this way, how else were they going to repay all their heavy debts? Javier looked at him quietly for a moment, surprised by the honest emotion in Soho's voice. Then he admitted that, yes, this was the best solution for now, even if it was not perfect. But Javier also gave a warning. He reminded Soho that the Baron's black coal was untouched because people did not know about it. In fact, several of the previous barons had tried to mine it before. As he explained this, Soho cut him off and showed that he already knew. He said the mines had collapsed back then because the bedrock was too weak. But Soho did not look worried at all. He smiled with confidence, and proudly claimed that he had something different, the benefit of modern excavation technology. He called it the shield tunneling method, something completely unknown to Javier. With growing excitement, Soho lifted his shovel high in the air and shouted that it was time to get to work. His voice was full of energy as he marched forward toward the mountain, ready to start the next step of his plan. Javier watched him walk away and thought to himself with confusion about this new method Soho mentioned. He had never heard of it before, but in the end, he decided to trust Soho. This new lord was nothing like the ones before. He had a clear vision and the courage to chase it. Not long after, the sounds of digging echoed through the valley, and a cave was carved into the mountain, the beginning of something big.